All right. Well, I got 9:01 on my end. I think we'll go ahead and do the few introductions here to get started for everyone. And then we'll go ahead and get started. It'll take us a few minutes to introduce everything and do a few housekeeping comments about how today's presentation will work. So my name is Jim Jansen. My contact information is listed on the left-hand side of the slide that's being shared with everyone currently. And we also have Anastasia Meyer. Anastasia Meyer's kind of taking the role of what Alan Benalik did with our program. Her contact information is on the right. I'll ask her to introduce herself just in a minute here. I wanted to comment that depending upon when you registered for this meeting, you may or may not have the physical handouts sent to you. We will be sending out a second batch of handouts. It may be early next week. The staff member that's helping with the mailings is taking a little bit of time off. So just be aware that if you haven't gotten the handouts, I hope you have them, say Thursday, Friday of next week or so, but they will be coming. So if you just want to take notes on scratch paper, that's great today, but just be aware you're going to have the full slide set. So the information is coming, and I'll remind everyone about that. But hopefully, if you did register before, I think last Thursday of this past week, the handout information hopefully got to you in a timely manner. And also, Ryan Evans, our media specialist, has shared in the chat pane that if you'd like to have a virtual copy of the handouts or the slides today to follow along, the link has just been shared in your chat. Once again, depending on when you registered, will influence whether or not you have gotten the handouts quite yet. Okay. Anastasia, would you like to say a few things?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia. I am in the southeast area of Nebraska. So I'm here to help anybody really across the state, but I focus on the southeast area. I'm an ag economist, just like Jim is, and we can ask and answer some more questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you guys for joining us.
Yes, Anastasia and I are working statewide on the topic of farmland succession and transition. Today's meeting is a landlord-tenant cash rent meeting that has a little bit of a flavor of succession. You'll see in the first part of this presentation, we get a little bit deeper, but I'll tell you, just hold on. I will guarantee that we will provide you with some high quality information on the current state of cash rents in 2024 with the newest numbers. And also give you some tips here, regardless of your age. It's always really good to be keeping considerations in mind for transition and succession. One other thing, today's handouts and mailing was partially paid for by the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center with the grant number listed there. And also financial support was provided by ZAG Land to help cover mailing and printing costs. I believe there might have been a handout slipped inside. Please reach out to Sam Zock if you need help with anything. You can see his list of services there. And if you'd be someone that would like to sponsor a meeting in the future, shoot Anastasia or myself an email, and we'd be happy to sponsor you, but we're always looking for good companies to partner in delivering our information. Sam Zock is the owner of ZAG Land, and you can see his different things that he can help people out with. One of the things he asked me to mention is he can do a no obligation lease review for you. So if you're still struggling trying to figure that out for 2024, please reach out to him if that would be something he might be able to help. Okay, so just briefly, an overview today, and this is kind of the structure of our landlord-tenant cash rent meeting. First part, we'll be taking a look at what is your land worth, more importantly, the market value of land. I'm going to segue just a little bit off the topic of a landlord-tenant cash rent meeting. I want to talk about what an appraisal is and how do you find an appraiser. I just got asked this twice in the last week. So we'll talk about what that means. How do you own your land? Anastasia will pick up the third bullet point on there. Some of the basics of land ownership might influence how you might manage the property, proper communication strategies. And the second half of our presentation, I'll start again and we'll take a look at how do you handle cash rents, other considerations related to that for 2024. And Anastasia will also put in a few lease provisions, some of the good things that we need to be considering here for 2024. And then finally, a little bit of a motivation to get you kick-started on what does an estate plan look like. So today's presentation, we'll be trying to give a few examples that are a little bit more pertinent to the western half of the state. But if you know someone that would like to join our meeting tomorrow, it'll be very similar information. And if you just would like to join us again tomorrow, I believe you could join us tomorrow as well. There's no additional cost or anything on our end. So this program will be archived and you'll be able to watch a YouTube style video where you can go out online and watch it in your privacy and convenience of your own home whenever you. All right, so first thing, what is your land worth? And this ties in with the idea on the market value of land. Just a little bit of background. I'm sure many folks that are joining us today have seen this information in the past. The University of Nebraska has done an annual survey since 1978 of people that work in the land industry. Each year, we do two different things based on the surveys that are reported. One, we do what is called the preliminary estimates. The preliminary estimates, the information from that was published on March 13th, 2024. That's one reason it took a little bit of time to get everyone their handouts for today was we had to get everything updated with the new numbers and plus get a couple hundred copies printed. So just be aware that the preliminary estimates are coming out in mid-March of each year. Final report comes out in June and it has a lot of additional information beyond the preliminary estimates. Either report may be found at the Center for Ag Profitability website of cap.unl.edu/real estate. If you have a tough time finding it on there, or if you just would like to a physical copy or a printed copy, you can always stop by your local extension office if you're located in the state of Nebraska. Many of the office managers tend to have a couple pages printed off for your convenience, and they provide individuals with the ability to get a copy at their local office if they'd like. So, and Ryan Evans also slipped in the chat pane the real estate website link if you'd want to take a look at that. And if you have questions as we're going along, I don't know if I'm going to stop and answer everyone as they're entered, but in the Q&A pane, we'll stop periodically or at the end of today's lecture and we'll review those. Just a little bit on the geography of Nebraska. The information, the university does kind of a regional survey. The first part of my talk today, we'll be taking a look more so at kind of the greater western half or the state of Nebraska in general. Then we're going to step down to a region. These regions are called the agricultural statistic districts, or more commonly, people refer to them as the crop reporting districts. And hopefully you can see my cursor on here. And we're kind of focusing on roughly the western half, northwest, north, central, southwest, and south. But like I said, the information presented today will be applicable to the eastern third if you're joining us, or even the central or south. Okay. So first thing, what is your land worth? And what is your land worth related to the current market value of land? So let's take a look at this. The first thing you'll notice on this slide is the estimated market value of land when we did our survey work was the estimated value is a point in time. Think of it kind of like the old farm photos you see. It's an aerial snapshot of that farm, given all the different circumstances that influence the market value. As of February 1st, 2024, we see the different market values up here. Overall, for the state of Nebraska, we've seen a third year of increase. Estimated market value was $4,015 an acre, about 5% over the prior year. And then we also see the breakdown across the state. A few things you'll notice. The rate of change, the increase, is much lower than it's been in recent years. And that's fine because we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in the ag economy. Commodity prices, or the expectation for commodity prices, aren't nearly as high as they've been. And with that being said, we're seeing that starting to be reflected in here, and maybe we're at some degree of an inflection. One other tip I'll give you if you're someone that is dealing on the issues of farm and ranch estate transition, succession, things like that. When we talk about the market value of something, if you stand to inherit it, we usually ask for, on the appraisal, we ask the person conducting the appraisal to please provide the effective date. They usually value the value of the land, the value of the estate, the day of someone's demise. So obviously we're past February 1st here, we're almost into April 1st here come next Tuesday. But always be aware that if you ever have to get any estate work done, the effective date, that February 1st, In this case, if you're valuing a farm estate, we're going to be focusing the day of someone's demise is a traditional time we get that. If you look through our slides today, you'll notice that they're numbered in the bottom right-hand corner. So if you're following along, please note that. Also, we're going to skip a few slides just to fit the format of our circumstance today. And there are different types of land. They're called land classes. And you'll see them here on this slide. We have slide 9. But if you keep going through the slides here, you'll see dry land, cropland, grazing land, irrigated cropland. And then if you take an average across all the different types of land, we have the Nebraska all land ag land value that's presented. Okay. Stepping back and looking here just briefly for a minute, what do we notice? Well, one thing we notice is if you take the historic value of land, that is in blue, that $40,015 an acre. It's in the extreme top right-hand corner that we have here. And in addition to that, we have the marketing year average price of corn. That's in red. There's some fairly eerie similarities between what happened about a decade ago versus what's happening right now. What I mean by that is we set a record price for corn, market value of land shot up. We've seen a period of decline, things kind of slowed down. Market value, the rate of increase either slowed down or gradually drifted down. And then we've seen similar things happen here. My guess is, unless the profitability of farming substantially changes, this might be the new high that we'll see for a while. Maybe we'll see a little bit of a moderation in the market value of land. It's anyone's guess, but I will say that higher interest rates and a lower expectation for farming profitability would be two fundamental forces that might be guiding the future value of land. Okay. And the other thing are interest rates. Now we have the 10-year Treasury yield rate, and if you read the newspaper, sometimes they talk about the T-bill rate. And I'm not suggesting we're financing ag land loans at 4%. You'd have to add probably another 3% onto this. But it is one factor for us to kind of show the extreme low that we've seen in interest rates during the COVID pandemic, and the gradual increase that we've seen in recent years to reflect the fact that inflation has been a much more of a concern than it's been in recent years. So just be aware that interest rates, there's that inverse relationship. If it costs more to finance something, all else equal, unless the person financing it has additional income to offset that interest expense, we tend to see a gradual weighing down on the market. Homes, cars, I've read different things that the used car prices have finally settled down a little bit. Some of you folks might notice at your local car dealerships, maybe availability is a lot better than it was, say, 6 or 9 months ago. I remember helping someone purchase a vehicle last August or September, in that time frame. There just wasn't any inventory. And when we were looking at used options, if you didn't buy them the day you test drove them, chances are they were going to be gone within the next day or two. So similar to the land market, we don't see necessarily used land sales, but I do feel that maybe the market has slowed down a little bit, and that's reflected in only that 5% gain instead of 30% over the prior 2 years here. And with it slowing down a little bit, we'll see what the future direction things might be headed. So I wanted to point this out for 2023. If you haven't done your taxes, I'm sure you're getting very close to hopefully getting everything pulled together. If you own a home or agricultural land in Nebraska and you file state of Nebraska income taxes, I didn't say you have to live inside Nebraska, but if you file a state of Nebraska income tax credit, or excuse me, an income tax schedule for the state, not the federal one, but the state one, you can get a tax rebate. The tax rebate on your real estate taxes, your tax credit, I should say, is going to be equal to 30% of the property taxes, which is roughly 50%. The credit applies to the portion of your real estate taxes that helps serves local K through 12 institutions or community college districts. So you're not getting a 30% of your overall tax burden back. You're getting 30% of the portion, the slide I said about 55, just be aware that depending on what county you're in, things can fluctuate a little bit. Some of the metro counties are a little bit different. There is a credit. Make sure you take advantage of it. If you haven't filed for it in recent years, there's ways to amend your prior year returns. I know there's been money set aside for this credit that has not been claimed. Talk to your tax preparer, or you check out the website link listed here, and you can take a look at additional details. Under last year's unicameral session, there was some slight enhancements made to this credit. There was a soft cap put in on how much the portion of real estate taxes that goes towards the school districts could increase. I say it's a soft cap because if a local public school district voted to exceed it, not the general public, but the school board, they could still exceed that. And they also allowed for an increase in the percent, that 30%, it can go up more than 30%. I believe it was 30% in 2022, and they held it steady at 30% in 2023. Stay informed. There's some pending legislation right now in the unicameral. Let your representative know your views on it. The current legislation would roughly increase real estate taxes, or excuse me, sales tax by about 1%. And in trade for that, there would be additional money set aside to help for real estate property tax relief. This is something that's being actively debated. You'll read the different newspapers across Nebraska. I'm sure you'll probably catch something in the next week or two because the legislative session will be getting tied up here. If I'm not mistaken, I think the final date that they're in section is around April 15th or 17th or something. So there's been changes made to this real estate tax credit in the last year. I anticipate there might be some additional changes at some point in the future. Just make sure you take advantage of this credit. Even if you live outside Nebraska, I know there's folks joining us today that live outside Nebraska. Just be sure to make sure you take advantage of it. And once again, you just have to own real estate. So whether a land or a home in Nebraska, and the and being, you have to own that and file a state of Nebraska income tax schedule in this state. The credit goes against your direct real estate taxes, the portion that helps support public education. Okay. So that's just some of the additional things that have changes that have been made, and I anticipate we'll probably have another update on one of our program slides here in the future on this. A few different things before we have Anastasia get started here. There's many different types of land in Nebraska. One of these is dryland cropland. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on here. My comment I'll make to everyone that's joining us today. These are regional estimates. They can give you some general ideas on how real estate varies across the state. You'll notice dryland cropland, corn, soybean, wheat prices, the expectation for fall of 2024 is much lower than it was a year ago at this time. And we're starting to see the real estate market, maybe it's steady, maybe it's slowed down slightly, 2-3%. You know, a 1 to 2% increase to me, that might say maybe things are just overall steady. But we see the market, it's slowed down a little bit, and that's fine. That's good to see gradual changes. We like to see gradual changes over time. We don't want to see things jump up 40% one year and down 50% the next. We want to see single-digit increases are a natural thing to see over time. Anytime you get into those extreme changes, we get into some of the challenges we've seen in the 1980s. Grazing land non-tillable. So there's dryland, cropland with or without irrigation potential, grazing land tillable and non-tillable. You'll see the breakdown that we have here on this slide on the different types of values associated with it. Center pivot irrigated cropland, the percent change. We notice, you know, a few areas where the market values slipped a little bit. To me, overall, this says things are fairly steady. And as I mentioned before, maybe this is some degree of an inflection point, unless something really changes to commodity or income across the farms in Nebraska. What is driving the real estate market? We'll have this updated here by this summertime, and I haven't updated it specifically, but what I can tell you in 2024, current livestock prices was definitely a driving force. 1031 tax exchange was another driving force. And things weighing down on farm real estate values has once again been different concerns related to input expenses or tax policies. I want to highlight, this is a little bit of a segue into the succession. I promise you this is good information just to be aware of and be knowledgeable on. I'm not telling you need to use it today or even in the next 10 years. I just want to make sure everyone's aware of it because, as I indicated before, it's a very common question that we get asked. When it comes to either purchasing land or if you stand to inherit something, you have to establish the value related to it. One way to establish that value is by getting what is called an appraisal. Simply put, an appraisal is someone's professional opinion of value. They take into account all the different things related to that local economy, corn, soybeans, wheat prices, farm profitability. They give some perspective. Okay, my well was drilled in 1976, but my pivot is from 2016. They account for those differentials. I have a really good well, or I have to have a couple wells linked together, or I get my water from an irrigation district, but it's a good supply and I never get cut back, or I do get cut back. They look at those different things. Also, if you have buildings, equipment sheds, irrigation equipment, how much are these either depreciated or functionally obsolete? What was built 50, 70 years ago is probably different than what might be built today. 70 years ago, a 5,000 bushel bin was a big grain bin. Today, maybe it's 25 or 35 or 50,000 bushel. Now, if you're in small grain country, the size of the bins are a little bit different out there, but in the major row crop producing areas, say in like Kearney, Nebraska, I would anticipate 50,000 bushel bins are a very common thing that we might see a contractor. So that's what an appraisal is. The farm real estate numbers that we briefly went over on the market value of land, that'll get you in the ballpark. It'll give you some rough ideas where things are at. To drill it down, to know specifically what you need to know, that's where we get an appraisal. What's an appraisal cost? Well, it depends on where you're at and how much ground do you have. It seems to me, based on just casual conversations with different stakeholders across the state, like they're joining us on the call today, 80 to 160 acres, 15 to 2,500, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less. How far does the appraiser have to go? Do you have a ranch that's up in the Sandhills and he or she would have to drive, say, 2 hours north out of North Platte to get to it? Versus do you own a property that's just within 5 or 10 minutes of Scottsbluff, Nebraska? It can make a big difference. Ranches tend to be considerably bigger. Instead of 80 or 160, maybe it's 760 or 7,600 acres. And that cost gets bidded into that. One thing I'll tell you, don't be afraid to get multiple bids. You know, you solicit the service of different people. How do we find an appraiser? One thing you can go is, remember, appraisers are licensed by the state of Nebraska. And with the professional license that they have to carry, you can go on their website, appraiser.ne.gov. You bring up this giant map. Now on this map, let's say you click on Scottsbluff. They're going to bring up every appraiser that has a mailing address in Scottsbluff County is going to appear. Now, obviously, Scottsbluff has several urban areas for Western Nebraska, 10 to 20, 30,000 people, whatever the case is. If you're someone that is in an area that you have a lot of residential homes, sometimes appraisers may only be a residential appraiser instead of being agricultural or commercial. So if you go on this website and you spring up a list of names and you say, oh, you know, so-and-so does only residential work, we'll ask them, hey, do you know of anybody in your area that does ranches or whatever the type of ground you have is? So look for referrals. Another website you can take a look at, there's a professional group of these individuals. It's called the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. I belong to this group as an academic member. I am not a licensed appraiser or farm manager or carry any professional licenses in this state. But just know with this group, you can, if you would like, you can go on their website and search for them based on geographic, or if you know somebody's name but not their contact info, it's another way to find that type of information. If I would redo my presentation here, I would say this should be qualities of a professional as part of your estate planning team. An appraiser, a banker, an attorney, CPA, maybe even a religious personnel. When we look for people that are they're a specialist in a certain area, an attorney that does farm and estate transition or executes estates. What do we need to be looking for? Well, for one, you got to find someone that's licensed in our state to perform the type of work you're looking for. If you're looking for a CPA, are they a CPA that's licensed in Nebraska? Also, do they have knowledge of the ag industry? There are CPAs that specialize in taxes, but maybe they only do personal taxes for primarily, let's say, residential property, or people that live in the cities or towns. They don't do ag work, or they don't do commercial. So you got to define what the heck you actually got going on. Send a simple description to these individuals. Maybe, okay, I got 160 irrigated acres 10 minutes north of Scottsbluff, Nebraska. You're defining what you have. Simple. When I see people deal on farm and estate transitions, especially if someone recently passed away, they get very emotional. Or imagine typing up either a 1-page or say even a half-a-page summary. Simple statements. Here's my property. The well was from this year. The pivot's from this year. Who actually owns it? Just simple statements. Don't waste their time, and hopefully they won't waste yours. And don't be afraid to shop around. I don't care who you are, what you work in. There are sometimes people get exceptionally busy, and if you need the appraisal done by May 1st, that means they might have to be working the weekends to get the work done or whatever. So all of these factors are some of the different things that we see right here. So what have we talked about today? And this is where Anastasia is going to pick up here in a slide. What have we talked about today? Well, we gave you an overview of our presentation, provided some basic insight on the current market value of land in Nebraska, some of the different economic forces that are impacting it. I've kind of got my glass globe off and cleaned it up a little bit to say what the heck's going on here. And next, we're going to talk on just the very basics of legal ownership related to land. And Anastasia should have just switched over. Anastasia, do you want to do a sound check, and then I'll mute myself and get off?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
You're good to go. I'll stop my sound and video, and if you got questions, just let me know.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about how your land is owned. And so you guys might have to do a little bit of research here. Okay, I'm on the right screen now. So most commonly, couples have joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. Or do you own your land tenants in common? It's very common for children to receive these assets from like land, houses, from their parents this way. We'll go into a little bit more detail, but joint tenancy, it's a separate titling. You have to have the WROS, the rights of survivorship, on that title. So what happens there is if you outlive your spouse and you guys have the joint tenancy or WROS on the title, the interest, the ownership passes directly to that other person. No probate is needed. You have immediate ownership upon the death. But like I said, it has to have that ROS on that title. There is no splitting it. One person owns 70%, one person owns 30%. It's all equal share. So if you have 4 people on there, it's going to be split among the 4 different people. That's one thing about joint tenancy or tenants in common. If you do not have the ROS on the title, it reverts to the tenant in common, which is everybody owns it equally, or everybody owns it. You have some issues with creditors on the death, the interest passed to the heirs. There's no separate interest. So you own 1/4, 1/3, however it's split on the tenants in common of every acre. You don't own the 40 acres of this section of land. You don't own the good 30 acres of the quarter. It's all 1/3 or whatever the split is of each acre of land. So this leads into some different issues here. You can be forced to sale. So each owner has the absolute right of partition for sale. They can force a sale. How it's written on the title dictates what you can do with it. So if you have tenants in common with your family and they want to sell their interest, what can you do? You can buy out their interest. You can force a sale if they don't want to buy out their interest, and you can force that sale, and then either another person can come in and buy everything. That is a possibility, or you can roll the dice and just hope for the best. This is the one option I do not recommend. Have a plan. If they want to sell their interest, either come up with a plan with the family to buy out the interest rather than forcing that partition, because our goal is to keep families together, keep the communication going, not have those situations happen. So tenants in common and joint tenancy decision have to come together and decide what happens to the ground. If one partner decides not to pay their taxes, everybody is liable. If one sibling gets into serious legal trouble, that land can become, somebody can go after that land. It is part of it, and it's not just, they can force a sale even though they're just going after that person's interest in the land. What happens if one sibling is farming the ground? How are you guys going to decide how to charge for that? How is the other siblings or the other parties that have that interest in the land going to get reimbursed? Just remember that if you inherit ground, if there are any liens against that ground, you also get all of those liens as well. So is everybody going to be able to pay on the liens? Because that's everybody's responsibility. A lot of times, especially as families are getting passed down, land is getting passed down, families are becoming more removed from the farm. A lot of people don't think about the liens that are against that land, and we just want to make sure that you can pay those liens and get some income as well. So communication with family members, having a plan for the land. We always talk about if you're getting land or if you're thinking about starting to inherit land, who should be involved in these conversations? Well, it's definitely the landowners. Their kids, you need to involve the kids. If you have land that is, let's say in Nebraska, and you have a family member that's on the coast, they might not be able to come to a meeting, but give them a phone call. They deserve at least a phone call, or saying, hey, we're going to talk about estate planning. Do you want to be involved? Yes, no, let them decide. Who else should be involved? Spouses. Spouses should be involved. We'll talk about these things a little bit more, but the most important thing to do as a family is to have a goal in mind. Is your goal to still be a family at the end of the day? You know, if it's greed is going to rip apart a family faster than anything. So have it in writing. Don't make that assumption. What is the goal of each person? Is it to still get together at Christmas, over the holidays? Be clear what you want. Do you want to farm? Does a grandkid want to come back and farm? Who participates in the conversations? Like I said, involve the kids, involve the in-laws. We want to involve the in-laws because a lot of times they're the ones asking the questions that nobody else is thinking about. A lot of times the kids and the parents who own the ground, they have that deep emotional tie to the land. And so they're usually thinking about that. And it's the in-laws who are asking those other questions that a lot of times that the others do not think about. If the grandkids are old enough and mature enough to involve in the conversations, sure, involve them. Because maybe they do want to farm, maybe they want to try to have a few head of cattle. Put all the options on the table. Talk about selling it, talk about transitioning it, just talk about everything. Keep a record, take notes. Maybe you record the conversation. Microsoft Word has this really cool dictate function where you can just open up on computer, open up a Word document, hit dictate, and then it will type up everything. It'll transcribe it all. When you're doing this, try not to do it on a holiday. Holidays are fun. Let's keep them fun. This deserves a separate meeting at a different time, preferably not around the dinner table. It's probably going to take more than one meeting, and be sure to involve everyone, including the off-farm families. Now, when I say get everybody's intentions, maybe somebody wants the section of land that surrounds their farm, and maybe somebody just wants grandma's pie plate. A lot of times family discourse happens when we don't talk about what we want, and it could happen, family discourse can happen easily over someone threw away grandma's pie plate, and that's what they really wanted because they had the memories of making pies with grandma, or maybe they wanted grandpa's tractor that another one thought was obsolete. Get those all out in the open of what every family member wants, what every family member thinks. So I always like to say, beware of those sweetheart deals. What are the sweetheart deals? Well, it depends on different situations. A sweetheart deal could be let's say a son is renting a piece of ground from his parents at a third of the county average rate. Now, your initial gut reaction is, well, that's not fair. That's not right. You shouldn't be hosing your parents like that. But we need to ask questions, not just automatically assume. If we ask questions, maybe we find out that he's paying the land taxes. He is taking care of all the fencing, all of the end of life care, those other expenses that are typically covered by the landowner, aka his parents. Maybe he's covering all of those, and so the parents just want that reduced rate. Another sweetheart deal is you inherit your family's farm, and let's say they didn't have a good transition plan, and so it's just everything is divided equally among the siblings. If you have shared farming operations, a lot of times they will share equipment. So maybe the son's power unit is on that field, or maybe the engine of the tractor belongs to the son, but the tractor itself belongs to the father. Make sure all of those situations are known about, because surprises cause problems. And so surprises cause problems. Ask questions to understand, not to just jump to assumptions. Get both sides of every story. And also beware of the promise of one day. Don't just assume that one day when your parents pass or when somebody passes that they have a transition plan, because a lot of people do not. So ask the questions. When you ask questions, make sure that you're listening. A lot of problems can be solved by just having good communication. So practice, make the partner repeat what you said, to make sure that you're heard and what you're saying is what you want them to understand or what you intended. Make sure that you listen as well to the other person's point of view, and spend a lot of time establishing that goal. Is a goal to keep somebody farming in the family and to spend holidays together? Is the goal to just keep the family farm owned by family, even though everybody is removed from the farm? Each family's goal is going to look a little bit different. And that's okay, but allow everybody to have input. Know that, different generations are going to have different values, and not saying that one value is better than another. It's okay if somebody values spending more time with family than working all the time. And it's okay if somebody values working, putting in all of those extra hours because it's going to lead to better outcomes for their family. No one value system of generations is going to be better than another. But remember that ye who has the gold makes the rules, that golden rule. So no matter if the input from the grandkids, the kids, the in-laws, no matter what, the person who owns that land, let's say the grandparents, they are going to make that final decision. Everybody is going to have to live with it, and hopefully input is heard and everybody is okay with that decision. So choosing to keep the farm in the family. Let's say you choose to keep the farm in the family. The first option is, you have a couple different options, is somebody farms that property. If it's a family member, is there going to be a rental agreement? If I would say yes, and we're going to talk about the need of different leases and having everything in writing in a little bit. But if you're going to rent to a family member, how much is it going to be discounted? Is it going to be discounted? Are you going to do a crop share or cash rent? And other considerations. A lot of times, like I said, we have these deep emotional ties to our family land. So if they are using that farmstead house outbuildings, if you have different expectations, or if you have expectations of that, you need to let them know. So I'll use a personal story here. I farm, or my husband and I farm, and we rented a piece of ground, and it's always a worst case scenario when you hear from somebody else that somebody isn't happy with you. And so you ask questions, and to come to find out that the landowner thought that we should be mowing around the house. And I guess my thought was, I'm not renting that, so it's not my responsibility. So by communicating there, we solved a lot of issues, and figured out, she thought I should be mowing it. I thought it wasn't my responsibility. We came to an agreement there. But if you have those expectations that, the farmstead needs to be upkept, even if you're not living there, or the outbuildings need to be maintained, or if you're using those outbuildings, those should be reflected in that rental agreement. So if you're mowing, maybe you get discounted rent. If they're using the outbuildings, are you going to charge for those outbuildings? Some other considerations like that need to be thought if somebody in the family is going to farm the property. So a professional farm manager, if you are considering using a professional farm manager, you're going to rent your ground out to a farmer. Just know that the farmer will probably do a little recoil when you mention the word manager. It's almost going to be like an allergic reaction with it, but they can really be valuable for absentee owners, especially, or if a piece of ground is going to be split up among multiple people. As a tenant, it's easier to talk to a farm manager, one person, than to come to an agreement on 4 different people who own the land equally. It's easier to talk to one person, especially when everybody's values might not be the same, or everybody's thoughts might not be the same. So it is especially valuable, but you're probably going to need to tell that to the person that you are renting to. Managers charge anywhere between 6 to 12%. They can be a great resource, especially to absentee landowners, or if the family is not exactly cohesive. Or if you are inheriting a piece of land and you know nothing about it, and you just want to make sure everything is being taken care of the way it is. depending on how much involvement is how much they're going to charge. If they're really active and they're doing a lot, there's going to be higher. If they're just, you know, collecting a check and dividing it out among the owners, it's going to be less. It could be a very worthwhile opportunity for people. So check it out, but just know that when you bring it up, most farmers will probably have a little bit of a recoil for it. And I say that just knowing that I think it's because most people, most farmers are used to that handshake agreement there. And by bringing in a farm manager, I think they think that they're not to be trusted. And that's not the case. We're just trying to make good relations, good communications among everybody. So you could have the option to custom farm the property. So when you custom farm the property, you hire a producer to complete all the field operations, and you're going to pay them on a per acre basis or a percent of the crop basis. You pay for all of the inputs, all the expenses, but you get 100% of the crop unless you're going to pay on a percent of the crop basis. When you rent out the ground, you have less risk, and that's, can you see my cursor here?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So when you rent out your ground, let's say that you are a landowner, you're going to cash rent, you have a little risk because you know what your payment is going to be every single year. The flex rent agreement, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Flex rent agreement, you have a little bit more risk. You have a little bit more reward because on a good year, you could get a little bit more. Crop share, you have a lot more risk, but on good years, you could have more reward. And custom farming is probably the riskiest because you're paying all the input, you're paying all the expenses. And if it's a crop failure, you know, you're going to wish you had a cash rent because that is guaranteed every year, whereas income is not guaranteed all the year. It's opposite for tenants. So that's why I think a lot of people are moving towards flex rents, or, you know, they like the crop share because the risk is going to be shared among both parties. So what is a custom farming arrangement? So like I said earlier, the operator supplies all the labor and equipment needed to perform planting operations, tillage, pest control, harvesting, hauling the grain to the elevator or to storage. And then they're going to get paid on the per acre arrangement, or for each operation. If you have, let's say you have a planter, but you don't have a combine, you would pay for that harvest to happen, and you could pay by acre. Or some are going a percentage of the crop, sometimes 20 to 25%. Yeah, it just kind of depends. If you do a percentage of crop share, this gets a little bit trickier with the FSA because do they classify this as a crop share agreement rather than a custom farming arrangement? So just to be aware of that if you're going to go off of a percentage. But the landowner is going to pay all the expenses and receive all the crop payments from any farm programs and all the crop revenue. A crop share agreement is you're going to have an agreement and you're going to receive a percentage of the actual crop yield. So let's see, is this the next slide? Nope. All right. So usually the landowner shares an input in production costs of raising the crop. I like to say if it's a yield increasing input, that's what is typically shared. And what you input in is what you should receive back. It's a delicate balance. So is fair equitable? Well, fair and equitable are not the same thing. So we just want to make sure it's a fair way that if all the expenses are going to be split properly, you're going to want to sit down with your producer. It's going to take communication. It's going to take you guys talking to one another, but it's going to require both of you guys to sit down and market your grain individually, but you share in that with risk and reward. So what's common? It depends on where you live. So the smaller amount is typically going to go to the landowner. And irrigated ground or eastern central Nebraska, A lot of times it's 50-50. Each one receives 50% of the crop. They share on 50% of the inputs. In non-irrigated land in southeast, south central, it's going to be that 40-60 split. And in the panhandle, it's a lot of the 1/3, 2/3. But it really depends on the crop, where you're located, and what your expenses are. We typically ask, get asked, what's the typical share? Well, it all just depends on what you guys are going to negotiate as the tenant and the landowner. So both parties are going to receive their revenue of the crop sales. Both are going to have crop insurance if they choose to purchase it. And so if it triggers a payment, both of you will receive payments, and any government disaster programs if they are triggered. And so this balance is a good indication of showing, like, your landlord expenses and input should be equal to what you put in, and so should the tenants. You're gonna want to figure out what your expenses are versus what your income is, and see where that is, because we don't want it to be in out of balance. We just want to make sure everyone's getting their equal amounts. So what is typical? And I say typical in quotations, but the landlord is going to pay all the land taxes, irrigation operation and maintenance, if there is any, the irrigation ownership, the repairs, the taxes on the pivot, all of that is going to be covered by the landlord typically. Then the tenant is going to cover all of their labor, any minor irrigation repairs. So when I say minor, usually we like to see in a lease up to 500, 1,000 is typical. Either one of those numbers up to the repair of that amount, and then the landlord covers the rest of the repairs. They're going to cover all of their field operations. They're going to cover the cost of transporting the landlord's share of the crop to either the elevator or wherever they want to take it. So then both parties are going to share in the price of their crop insurance, fertilizer, insecticide, fungicide, and herbicide, and the energy for irrigation. Like I said earlier, the yield increasing inputs are going to be covered. Then we have seed. Seed is one that is debatable, and it kind of depends on where you're at. As seed technology has advanced and seed has really increased in price, I see a lot of people sharing in the cost of seed. And each lease is a little bit different based off of what they're breaking down, but sometimes they share the complete cost of seed. Sometimes they share the seed technology fee. So the extra cost of having that additional technology in the seed that is going to reduce the insecticide, fungicide, the need to apply all of that, they share in the cost of the technology. So this is something that both the landlord and the tenant are going to need to talk about and see what they're willing to share on. I have seen some 50-50s share in all the seed. I've seen 60-40 share the technology of the seed, and I've seen 70-30s share in none of the seed. So it just kind of depends on what you and your tenant or what you and your landlord are going to agree upon. And like I said earlier, they're both going to market their share of the crop. And Jim.
Okay. All right, let's see here. Give me 1 second here, and I'm gonna switch my screen over here. Just give me 1 second. And let's get these slides switched over here quick. Okay. So there's been one question typed in here, and I always like to kind of step back and review what's been covered in a section to make sure we're all on the same page. So briefly, when I first started the meeting off today, we talked about the current state of land values and how do you get an appraisal. Anastasia stepped through some basic things related to ownership of land. Many of us have land that will go to someone or something at some point in the future. Depending on how you set that up in the future, that might influence things. In addition to that, one other thing to be keeping in mind is the current state of cash rents. And we had a very interesting question came in here, so I'm just going to kind of set this up quite well, or kind of wraps up everything that Anastasia and I have talked about. The question goes on, you have someone that owns some grazing land in Cherry County. They have a long-time tenant on the property. Person has done a lot of work. They put in what Anastasia referred to as sweat equity and helping care for it and establishing rotational grazing, good things for the land. And they want to give the tenant the first right of refusal, the first ability when these individuals are no longer here, and their kids inherit the property. They want to give the tenant the first ability to purchase the land. How do we do this? How do we set up a situation that makes sense, given that the ground is going to go to the kids, but also you have a bunch of sweat equity that the tenant has put into the property? Well, there's one concept you can define in your will or your trust or however this land is going to be distributed once you're gone. It's called first rights of refusal. And if your kids are going to get an appraisal done on the property, you could put in your final directives at the end of your life that the tenant has a first right of refusal to purchase the property at the current appraised value. Okay, so if the property appraises for so many dollars an acre, the tenant has a first right of refusal to say, hey, I'll buy it at that price, or you know what, I don't want anything to do with it. So that's one way to handle that. And one other thing that we've seen in extension over time, if you have a long-term tenant that has invested a significant amount of time into a property, you can give a deduction off the appraised value or the current market value. What I mean by that is that for every year this person has rented the property, if you want to take 1% off the sale price or a 0.5% off the sale price. So an example, if this person has rented the property for 25 years and you want to take off 1% for every year that they've rented it, you could have in your final directives, hey, the tenant has first right of refusal of the current market value of the price, and we're going to take 1% off the year for every year that they've rented it since 1995, whatever year it is. If it's been about 25 years, you take 25% off the sale price. If it's been 40 years, maybe you just take 0.5%. Most land loans need around 20 to 30% of equity in that purchase. So either you got to have the cash or another parcel of land to put up to buy it in order for that individual to get a loan, unless they have the cash sitting around. That's why we have suggested to value that sweat equity by giving 1% off the sale price, trying to get that discount. That discount would allow that individual to hopefully be able to get financial means to buy it. So that's my comment on that. There's many different ways, but I do feel that if you have a strong connection to someone that's farming the property, that might be one good way to handle something like that. Okay, so now we're kind of on to the cash rent portion of the slides. I know this is kind of the hot topic. Many people that joined us today really would like to know. And what we'll do is we're going to start more at the regional level, and then we're going to step down to the farm level, or to the county, and then down to the farm level. The information provided from the University of Nebraska today will be for the 2024 cash rents. And we are also on slide 50 at this point, if anyone is following along or watching this recording again in the future. So let's start with the dryland cropland cash rents. First thing, here in 2024, what are we seeing with cash rental rates? I know some people have set their cash rents ready, and I know some people still might be negotiating. Generally across the state, we kind of seen a mixed report on cash rents. Some areas are basically steady or down just slightly. Some areas down even a little bit more. Some areas up just slightly. Overall, I would probably say if you did an average across all the cash rents, it would be pretty darn close to steady. But we are seeing a little bit of slippage in the cash rents because commodity prices, the expectations are probably lower than they were a year or two ago. And also, there's probably additional concern related to input expenses and how does farm finances figure out for the person that's renting our property. So the overall average here in the Northwest, North, Southwest, Central, and South, seen a couple cases where they're down slightly, cases where they were up just a little bit. Now this is on dryland cropland. We will talk about grazing land here just in a few slides. In addition to the average that we had on the prior slide for 2024, we also have up here what is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the low grade, and the overall average. The average of the high grade is we ask people that take the survey, what do you estimate the upper third of cash rent is? And then we ask the people that take the survey, what do you estimate the lower third? We don't associate, in Northwest Nebraska, it's not that you have to have a certain yield to achieve a cash rent of $50. This is just a regional breakdown that hopefully gives you some rough ideas on how cash rents vary around in each of the regions, okay? And this is for the 2024 season. Some additional detail on cash rental rates come from a group called the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And if you recall when I introduced the different regions of Nebraska by county, we had some insight on how cash rents vary around by region of the state. And the NAS rental rates that we see right here, they can we'll see in the next slides. They can give you some ideas on how do the cash rents vary around by each of the regions. Their work, the USDA work, that is typically published in the around the second week of September. This past year, this map you're going to see on the next slide actually came out on the I think it was about the first week of October. In recent years, they've been doing their survey every year. My understanding is their survey is conducted a little bit later in the growing season than what the University of Nebraska does, and it's done of actual farmers and ranchers. Okay. And you'll notice on this slide, we have the hyperlink right here. When you get these slides, you can actually type that in and find this website link. Or if you're following along in your packet of handouts, we're on slide 53. But the next slide, you'll notice it's going to be kind of hard to read all the numbers. And the next slide here by county actually is in the back of your handout. So if you registered for this meeting, you will be getting this paper handout that you're seeing up here right now. And this was for the 2023 growing season. As I said before, this information is published later towards the end of the growing season. The university publishes it more so on the start of the growing season. I want to point a few things out here. You'll notice some counties are in white, especially out here in the Sandhills. If your county's in white, there wasn't enough responses that they could produce an estimated value with confidence, okay? And also you notice like Merrick and Hamilton County, that's a heavily irrigated row crop counties. In these particular counties, they are predominantly irrigated. That might be one reason why you don't see a dryland cash rental rate. In the Southwest here, to pick on a region for a minute, you'll notice that the cash rents vary around. Okay, Lincoln County's at 69, Dundee County's at 45. It seems to me, if you're kind of looking at that county level breakdown, you can gain some insight on kind of trying to decipher how do the cash rents vary around in each of the regions. Maybe some of those counties are the lower third relate, maybe Dundee and Perkins and Keith are closer to the lower third, but Lincoln's closer to the higher third, and then maybe Chase, Hayes, and Frontier, maybe those are closer to the overall average. I don't know. This is just an idea to give you some insight on how do cash rents vary around in western Nebraska. An example, Scotts Bluff Valley in there, the Platte Valley there, clearly the cash rents are a little bit higher there than they are in, let's say, Dawes County, or vice versa. Okay, so as a reminder, this map is actually in the back of your handout, and you can also access the information if you go and look at the website link we provided. Seeing there's been a couple questions. Couple questions that came in. I don't want to have like 40 questions at the end of these slides. So let's just answer these quick. All right, first question, are there any rent to own lease arrangements? The most common thing that I've seen, or the closest thing to that, is what we call a contract for deed. I'm not seeing necessarily a rent to loan or a lease to own, similar to like, let's say, a piece of equipment or a car. A contract for deed is basically the landowner is acting as the bank. You sign a private contract with someone, and you set up a series of payments plus interest. The landowner is actually the one that's providing the financing. The landowner gets a small principal payment each year in addition to interest, and they set the terms for that lease arrangement. It used to be more common in the 60s, 70s, and maybe 1980s. I don't necessarily see very many of them, but the contract for deed would be the closest thing to a rent to own. Another question that came in was on the topic of, I might have, let's see here if I can get it back. But Anastasia also typed in, so you have someone here that said a cash rent that is based on the average of the South, and then they adjust that cash rent based on price at in Hastings. What this individual is getting at is what we call a flexible cash lease arrangement. A flexible cash lease is actually a form of a cash rent, but it's one way to account for different things that when you have some of this uncertainty in the commodity prices, you know, is the price of corn going to be good or flat or lower for the fall of 2024? This is one way to kind of account. So that's one way to set that up, and there were details in the question about that. But if you want to set a flexible lease arrangement up, nothing wrong with that. And be sure to consider something like that if you would like. Okay, we got all the questions taken care of. And Brian Evans also slipped in the chat. If you're looking for that county level map that we have up on the screen right now, he also slipped the link in the chat if you'd like to find that. Okay. All right, so let's continue on here. Breaking into the irrigated cash rents. The University of Nebraska reports gravity or flood irrigated cash rents in addition to center pivot. The center pivot rates tend to be around $30 to $50 an acre more than gravity or flood irrigated. And what you see here, we have a breakdown by region of the state. And, you know, once again, we're seeing here in the Northwest and North, things, and even in the Southeast, cash rents were down just slightly. Okay, it's the first time we've seen this in some years, and even in the Central District. Seen a few areas up here in the East, but overall, it looks to me that cash rents for irrigated cropland might have trended down just a little. And the other thing that we have here is we have the upper third average, the lower third average, and the overall average. These averages assume that the landlord has the well on their property, they have the irrigation equipment. If the tenant is pumping water from their property, or if they're using their diesel engine to pump that water, you would adjust the cash rental rate to account for the fact, especially on center pivot equipment, that the landowner is not the one that's having to maintain these things. Okay. And I think a little bit more common here in the state is center pivot irrigated cropland. And the center pivot irrigated rates that we have reported right here are a pretty good indication on kind of the regional averages. And we're seeing the eastern part of the state, they were fairly steady. Western part, you know, there once again, there are 2-3 regions that cash rents were down just slightly. And the breakdown here on cash rents for center pivot irrigated cropland assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system, pivot, pump, and power unit. If the tenant is providing one of those components, you would discount the cash rent to reflect the fact that the landowner is not either responsible for insuring, acquiring, or maintaining these different things. Okay, now I'll provide some rough estimates here at the end of my section in the second part of these slides on how much you might discount or adjust the cash rent to account for that. And so we have a pretty nice breakdown here. The other thing on center pivot irrigated cropland or even gravity irrigated, the question comes up, who is responsible for maintaining the irrigation improvements? It's a common question that we get. My comment to you on that is, I always jokingly say it's always the other party, but it's the individual that has the time, skill set, and equipment to do these things. If that happens to be the tenant that is providing basic upkeep and services on the pivot or the power unit or whatever the case is, we need to account for that. One way to account for that is to provide a discount to the cash rent. So many dollars an acre. You know, the tenant, hey, they're responsible for basic upkeep, but we're going to give a little bit lower cash rent because that's a good way to incentivize someone to do something like that. Okay. You'll notice on the USDA rates a few different things. Some of these counties are in white. Yes, I know there's a fair amount of irrigated cropland in Buffalo County, or even to a lesser extent in Banner County, but the county's in white. Now, once again, that's a case where if you don't get enough responses to people responding to the survey, so okay, we're looking here in Banner County and also looking here in Buffalo County, you'll notice that if they're in white, either there's not a lot of irrigated cropland, so that'd be the case for parts of southeast Nebraska, or they could not get enough people to respond to the survey. I think Platte County and Buffalo or Kearney, Nebraska would be kind of the case in point. So just be aware of that, is you have to get enough responses that that they can produce a number with confidence, and also that some of these counties, and I'm a bit more familiar here in central Nebraska, but like Kearney and Adams, so this would be the Minden and Hastings area in the South District, for example. If you still have a fair amount of gravity or flood irrigation in an area, the numbers that they report here are going to be a weighted average between the two. So meaning, okay, I'll just make this up. In Adams County, if a third of the county is still gravity or flood irrigated and the other 2/3 of the ground for irrigated cropland is center pivot, the average that they have reported here is going to be a reflection on the weighting between the two of them. Question that came in, I have a renter that owns the pivot on the property. What cash rent should I use? I'll provide some adjustments here in a few slides. We got to get through the grazing land. All right, switching gears here a little bit to grazing land in Nebraska, we can talk about pasture and cow-calf rental rates. I wish we could be doing this meeting today in person, but obviously there's probably people joining us from across the state. And with that being said, I want to talk briefly here on cash rental rates for cow-calf pairs and grazing land. So I'll give you a few different ideas. One, when it comes to renting crop or grazing land, there are many different ways to rent it. We can rent by the acre, we can rent by the head, the AUM. There's no right or wrong way to do it. The thing I will say though is we need to figure out a rental rate that's going to work for both parties involved. The university and the USDA report on a per acre rate, and then the university also reports on a monthly rate. So the rates that we see up here, these rates assume that the landowner is going to be renting to someone for 5 months, traditionally during that traditional late spring to early fall. You give or take a few weeks, but it's for the traditional 5-month grazing land period. If you're here in the western part of the state where they might do off-season grazing, we would need to negotiate that in. So if you're doing some early spring grazing and then you cut it for hay and then maybe graze it again in the fall or something, these cash rents would need to be adjusted to reflect some of those different things. And also the breakdown that we have on cash rent here, it's just not an average for the use of the property for, let's say, 5 months in the season. There's also some negotiations that go on related to who's responsible for different things. I will say, and I think Anastasia and I are both in agreement, we typically see people rent a property. We would hope that the initial lease arrangement, the property is in good shape. You got the weeds and the brush are controlled. The property overall looks pretty good. The fences are fairly well maintained. Going forward after that, the tenant's responsible for the weed control or minor upkeep on the fencing. If you are renting a property to someone that has severe issues, and this could go for irrigation equipment as well, if that individual is willing to help you out with those things. Anastasia and I both feel that fencing, that's a permanent improvement. Most people are not going to take out a 5-wire barbed wire fence after they leave the property. So if the landlord is willing to pay for that improvement, that stays with the property, and with it staying with the property, we would account for that in the cash rent by maybe considering a lower cash rent for a year or 2 or 3, depending on how many feet of fencing the individual helped put in, to account for the tenant's time, use of their equipment, the use of fuel, or whatever they're using to do these things. So this is the traditional per acre cash rent for 5 months in the grazing season. It's a one-time payment. You don't make this payment for each month. This is for a per acre rate. Maybe you pay it once, a portion when the cattle go on the property, a portion when the cattle come off, or maybe an overall average when the cattle are removed. Timing of the cash payment, that's negotiable. The USDA rates, you'll notice here, some of their heavily row crop areas, we don't have any cash rent. So yes, I know there's grazing land in Platte County. I was always kind of surprised this year that they had their rate reported in Douglas County, which is where Omaha is, but not necessarily in some of these other surrounding areas. So just be aware that these are the averages that we have broke down here. And that once again, hopefully everyone can see that, especially in the North District, for example, Cherry and Grant and Hooker counties versus Holt County, you almost see a threefold increase. So think back a few slides here where we were looking at that breakdown on cash rents, and hopefully you can kind of relate to that a little bit, okay? And now the other rate that the university reports is a per pair rental rate. So this is one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season, okay? And these rates assume that the landlord are not supposed to be providing any care. I do feel, especially in the North District here, some of these higher rates that we're seeing, maybe the landlord's not taking cattle in, but maybe they do basic things like, hey, I'll check the water. Maybe there's somebody bringing cattle up from Columbus, Nebraska out into Cherry County, or up from North Platte, or where. Under that case, where we have some of these rental situations, I do think the landlord is providing some degree or some component to this relationship where the tenant may be coming from further away, and maybe one way that they're getting a little bit higher cash rent might be providing, hey, I'll set the mineral out, or I'll check your cattle, at least make sure everybody looks like they're out there, some of those things. I will say that the cash rents and land values for grazing land, they were up a little bit higher percentage wise than what cropland was, because the expectation for livestock prices, especially cattle, a little bit better than it was a year ago, and that's maybe getting bid into some of these cash rents. Oh yeah, so since Anastasia stepped away from her last portion of our lecture today, what have we covered? Well, we've covered the regional cash rents. We've given you some basic insight on who pays for water, some of these considerations we need to have. The next part here, we're going to step through on some basic ideas on how do we figure out a cash rent for 2020. There are different ways to estimate cash rents. I give 3 or 4 different ideas in here. I think the second idea on the sub-bullet point will be a very popular one that people might be able to work. First thing, whenever it comes to setting cash rent, you need to find a cash rent that's truly going to be working with both parties involved as part of the lease arrangement. If you have a situation that isn't working, or if you have a situation where the individuals are not on the same page, we're going to have some issues. And that's when we've gotten different calls over the years. So you got to keep in mind both people. Okay, if you're working with a landowner that's in an assisted living facility that needs a top cash rent to make those ends meet, but you're working with a beginning producer that might be having to borrow the money at 10% interest, sometimes those things don't always perfectly align. By all means, we got to rent to beginning producers because the average age of farmers and ranchers is starting to get up there. So you have to take into account the needs and requirements of both parties involved. First idea. Okay, we figured out that, let's say the center pivot irrigated rental rate in Scottsbluff County, is making up an example here, is $190 an acre, and the average irrigated yield is 130. I know these numbers are not necessarily reflective of what Scottsbluff is, but we have to put together an example that works for you. If I take 190 and divide it by 134, that gives us what is called the rent per bushel. All this says is, in this made up example, $190 divided by 134, $1.42 of the sales price of that crop is going towards what? Going towards the county level. It's going towards the cash rent for the property. Is $1.42 a lot when it was $6 corn? It wasn't too bad. What about if the price of corn's only 4.5? Okay. So a fair amount of the cash rent is going towards the sale price is going towards the cash rent. If I take $1.42 in this example, slide it to the upper right-hand corner, and then I have what is called the APH yield. This is called the actual production history. It's a historic average associated with a insurance policy. With that, if I take $1.42 per bushel and multiply it by, see here, my little pointer. Sorry, I skipped ahead a slide. Trying to get my laser pointer. There we go. $1.42 per bushel times my actual production history. If I take the two of those together, that gives us what is called the farm level cash rent. We adjust what we knew here, but we adjusted it down a little bit because the ground I'm renting isn't as good as the county averages. Now, if it was 139 bushel per acre, we'd actually address the cash rent up just a little bit because we're producing more than the county average. So it kind of depends where you're at and the attributes of the property. Okay. Another example we have here is called cash equivalent from crop share. So in this made up example, let's say a field produces 160 bushel per acre. Landlord gets half the crop, tenant gets the other half. Okay. And also with that, in this example, when I made it, let's say we thought the price of corn was going to be $4.66 a bushel. So really the landlord's getting half of the income. And under a 50-50 crop share, half the seed, fertilizer, chemicals, and in the case of irrigation, half of the energy, diesel or electricity, is going to be paid by the landlord, the other half by the tenant. And also the crop insurance, each party involved in the crop insurance on our crop share has the right but not the requirement. They can choose to take out crop insurance on their share of the policy on half the crop in this example. If I take the difference between half of the income minus half of the expenses, that gives us what roughly the tenant would be willing to pay the landlord, would be roughly what the landlord stands to make per acre from a lease arrangement. Now we get over here until July, and let's say things were looking kind of dry, and prices really came up nicely. But then you get here till November, and remember, when you spend the money on an input, you can't get your money back on your seed that you planted or chemicals. I mean, it's a fixed cost for a short period of time. So just because the price of corn or the crop yield bounces around a little bit, depending on what's going to happen, when you invest that money in fertilizer and it's out there, now there might be some carryover effects, especially on fertilizer to the upcoming year or two. That's a good thing. But this just kind of gives us a demonstration on how cash rent can vary subject to our expectation for prices. Okay. And let's say we have a property, get some hay land. Say we raise about 1.5 tons per acre. And we could have two different shared lease arrangements. In one case, the landlord gets a third of the hay, don't pay for any expenses. The other case they have here, the landlord gets half the hay, but they have to pay half of the fertilizer bill. You've sprayed it with fertilizer and found it to be a useful input. So, you know, commonly on hay land, maybe you spray it for weeds or fertilizer, or maybe even half of the net wrap or the twine on the bale. Under this case, we figured out that, oh goodness, you know, the price of hay is so high. Let's say it's 180 a ton, which is maybe going to be a little bit high for this year. I know Western Nebraska got a little bit of rain last year, so maybe hay prices aren't so high out there. But you can actually plug in your own information here, and it can give you some ideas on how cash rent can vary based upon what does the property actually yield, what's the hay worth. You're basically trying to answer the question, what would the land tenant be willing to buy out my share of the hay for? They'd be willing to pay some of these things that we're seeing up here right now. Okay. And the final example is called return on investment. Land is an asset. Every asset has a return, positive or negative. I can guarantee you that. If you know the market value of land and times it by what we call the cap rate or the rate of return, that gives us another way to estimate the cash rent. I think this is probably more of a banker's example. I do feel that these two examples, you can plug in your own information in here, plug in what you see fit. You and your tenant can argue about, the basics of what should be in the expense or what's the crop yield or the price. But if you take the difference between the landlord's share of the income and yield minus their share of the expenses, that's one way to figure out that cash rent. The land tenant is roughly paying the landlord in cash rent on what a reasonable expectation would be on what they might stand to make from a crop share. Okay. My comment on return on investment, if you're interested in this, the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Report, I believe it's table 5 in the report, actually provides an estimated rate of return. And you have to be very careful on what you're using in the market value. If you think your land's worth $20,000 an acre and you want a 5% return, I don't know of any land in Nebraska that is going to give you that kind of return for an agricultural use. Okay. All right, so we just stepped through, started at the regional level, went down to the county, some farm level examples. Keep in mind those farm level examples are going to be in your handouts if you haven't gotten them. They will be posted with them and you'll be sent them eventually. And let's talk a little bit about lease trends, and then we'll have Anastasia step in. And by all means, I've answered a lot of these questions so far, but if you got questions for Anastasia, please reach out to her through via the chat, and I will ask her the questions, and hopefully she can answer some, or hopefully she can answer some of these questions as well. So, what is the most common type of lease arrangement across Nebraska? That was a basic question that we asked as part of our real estate survey. And we actually have a breakdown here by region. Okay, so we got the west, central, and east. And with this breakdown, you can gain some insight on what is the most common. Well, in western Nebraska, you see a lot of blue. You see a lot more crop shares in western Nebraska than you do, let's say, in the eastern part of the state or even the central part. So why is that the case? Well, farming in western Nebraska is a little bit more risky because of drought, hail, fire. I've seen some of those different things over the year out there, especially fire, unfortunately. And in eastern Nebraska, especially the northeast, it's maybe not quite as risky to farm there relative to the western part of the state. And that's why you might see more cash lease arrangements, for example. Who's responsible for maintaining that old irrigation system? Well, we actually asked this as part of our 2023 cash rental rate survey. A little less than half the time it's the landlord and the tenant. A third of the time it's a tenant. The other portion of the time it's the landlord and the tenant. I will say it's not uncommon across Nebraska to see that the tenant's responsible for the first so many dollars in expenses. Maybe the first $500, like you gotta get a flat tire fixed or a new gearbox. Anything above that, the landlord will either reimburse them or they'll come up with an agreement where they may discount the cash rent to reflect that in the future. Okay. And what should be the discount on cash rent when the tenant owns the irrigation system? Well, a little over half the time it's somewhere between 26 to 50, and a third of the time it's around 10 to 20. So that's the discount. So if the tenant is the one providing the pivot, we had a question asked on this. Remember, if the tenant provides a pivot, they're responsible for the taxes on repairs, upkeep, insurance. That's a big expense on pivots as well. So we have a situation here where the landlord is the one providing the pivot, or excuse me, providing the cropland. They own the well and they own the power unit, but that old pivot they had out there, something happened to it. So the tenant brought over the irrigation, the pivot, whether they built a new one or brought over a used one, doesn't matter. And we have the breakdown on this slide to suggest that, about half the time, $26 to $50 an acre. So if you think the irrigated cash rent should be, let's say, $250 an acre, you would discount, let's say, $35 an acre, and the cash rent would actually be about $215. Okay. I would say, and I think Anastasia will see this in her position as well. She's been on board with us for about a half a year now. Based on my call volume, I think around I would say around $35 to $45 an acre is a pretty common adjustment. take off that cash rent when the tenant is the one providing the pivot. Okay. And if the tenant provides a power unit, this is probably a little bit more common. So you have an irrigated parcel of land that the landlord owns. They own everything out there, but they don't own that diesel engine. Under that case, about a third of the time, the land tenant takes off around 1 to 9, and another more than a third of the time they take off 10 to 12. And these discounts, the discounts on the prior slide, June typed in a question here. The discounts on the prior slide and the discount on the power unit. This is taking it off the irrigated cash rent if the tenant provides this. Remember, the irrigated cash rent is just not a return on the equipment. It's also a return on the land. When I say a return on the equipment, that's for either acquiring, upkeeping, or maintaining over time. Okay. So these are just two estimates. My call volume would say 10 to 15 bucks an acre would be a very common discount one to take off the cash rent when the tenant is the one providing the irrigation improvement, the diesel engine, and that thing is there like that. Okay, so moving on here. I think we're going to go ahead and have Anastasia get started. Are there any, and I'll remind you, I just tried to answer some questions. I know there will be some questions here on proper lease provisions. So Anastasia will go ahead and get switched over here just in a second. And you ready to go? All right.
Yep.
I can hear you.
Oh, do you want to answer that question before we move on? Or make a comment on it?
Why don't I'll let you go ahead and take it.
Okay. So the question is, he has one parcel where the tenant provides the center pivot and the power unit, and he rents it out on a gravity irrigated average. That is okay, just as long as the tenant and the landlord are agreeable to that agreement. If you guys have calculated it out and each of your needs are met, then that is a perfectly fine way to do that. So I'm going to talk about proper lease provisions. We talk about having these leases, and a lot of these leases are still done with a verbal handshake agreement, but we want to try to really urge people to have these leases in writing, because not only does it provide protection for the landlord and tenant, it also eases a lot of miscommunications, or it eases transitions if someone were to pass away, because it's in writing, the heirs then know what is expected. So some proper lease provisions that we want to talk about is, let me get to the right screen, is as inputs are still high and crop commodity prices are decreasing. One of the first things that may happen is fertility may be mined out of the soil. So phosphorus is a rather costly fertilizer to put on, and so you might consider having a minimum left at the end of the lease. So what this is going to require is a soil test before you get a new tenant, and then if you get rid of them, if a new tenant, you decide you want to get a new tenant, you're going to have another soil test to show that the minimum is left. I like to say about 30 parts per million. You can have a maximum application. So manure is commonly applied. And if you're going to put on a manure application, I would limit that to 1 time a year, because too much phosphorus is not always a good thing. And protect the tenant with a clause that if they are going on and putting on a large amount of phosphorus, let's say they really needed to build it up, they should have a multiple year lease with a prorate clause that say, if let's say it was 5 years, if they left on year 3, they would get 40% back, because it's 2 years of phosphorus that they did not get any benefit out of. So just consider these different provisions. Like I said, it's gonna require a soil test. The soil test at the beginning is gonna be a landlord expense because you're setting the expectation. And then lime is typically a landlord expense. However, a lot of times in Nebraska, we see that the tenant is applying it if the soil test indicates that lime is needed. Since lime stays with the soil, and if the tenant is going to apply, they need to have that multiple year lease with that prorate clause. And you can have a clause in there that says every year you're going to reevaluate that rental rate if you're doing a cash rent, but it needs to have a prorate clause that if they're going to leave before the lifespan of the lime, that they need to get their share out of it. And typically lime is a 5-year. Every 5 years, lime may need to be applied, but we think of it as a 5-year lifespan. So some soil health and environmental concerns that we need to think about in leases is who fixes the erosion? Well, if you have a massive erosion problem, like the first picture, that's going to require a little bit of work. It's not just going to be a simple disking job. You have some issues there, whether it's going to be needed to be reworked, tiled, something like that. That's going to be a landlord expense. Any major excessive erosion problems are going to be a landlord expense. The small ditches, the small erosion problems, that's going to be a tenant expense. Who controls cedars and noxious weeds? Well, it kind of depends on what you guys have come to agreement on. Typically, noxious weeds are going to be the tenant going to be controlling them. However, if you do not control your noxious weeds, the landlord is going to be getting that letter from the county. So maybe you guys work out an agreement that the landlord pays for the chemical, the tenant sprays, the rent reflects that amount. Cedar trees, especially in pastures, we always like to say, when you get a new tenant, have it in good condition, and then they're in charge of maintaining that. And then if it's a lot of work, if I were to get this pasture down here, I would ask for a reduced rate because it's going to be a lot of time out there controlling cedars. So, or if you're going to burn, have the landlord involved just because of the liability. And we'll talk about liability in just a little bit. But some other soil health concerns or provisions that we see in leases are sometimes no-till versus till and organic versus non-organic production. If you really have a strong opinion on one of these, you can require that. However, I would not have both of these at the same time, because if you have a field that is currently certified organic and you want to make sure it stays organic, well, you're not going to be able to put in also a no-till consideration in there, because you're going to be needing to do some tillage in organic production, and also be willing to kind of flex a little bit on the tillage consideration if you have that in the lease, because sometimes you'll need to go and work on the backside of the terrace, and that's considered tillage, and that could be breaking a lease. So just some different things to think about in your lease if you're going to have these different soil health provisions in there. If you have a lease that involves a pasture or just any pasture, who's going to take care of the fencing? Typically, the fencing is a landlord expense. Now, if you're going to have a tenant do some major repairs, like I said earlier, or like Jim said earlier, that should be reflected in the rental rate. But for pasture, you need to have a lease that says what happens in the big 3 disaster events. So if you have a fire, hail, or drought, are you going to pull the cattle off early? Are you going to have a late in, late out penalty? So pastures in Nebraska have a 5-month lifespan, and whether you're in the east or west, it kind of depends on when you're going to allow cattle to be out to pasture. So if they put in cattle early because they need to, are you going to have a penalty? Is that going to be a costly penalty, or is that going to be just making them pull out their cattle early? If you have a fire, hail, or drought, if they how much time do you need to give them notice saying, hey, you need to pull out your cattle, the grass is not looking great, we want to make sure that we maintain the grass. How much notice are you going to give them before you acquire them out? If that needs to be in a clause. Are you going to have a reduced rental rate if they pull out a month early? Are you going to prorate that rental amount? What if they decide that the grass is looking a little bit poor? What's going to happen there? So these all needs to happen in writing, in separate clauses about what's going to happen in the big three disasters. Then we want to talk about hunting rights too. So no matter if it is a pasture lease or a cropping lease, if you have a verbal lease, the hunting rights, all the rights of that land go to the tenant. So for cropping ground, if you have a verbal lease, that is for the whole 12 months, starting March 1. In a pasture, that is only a 5-month period, but regardless of the time frame, all of those rights go to the tenant. So if you want to go out there and hunt, or if you want to go fish during either the 12-month cropping or the 5-month pasture time, the tenant has every single right to file a trespassing charge on you, because those rights go with the property that they are renting in a verbal lease. However, if you want to keep the hunting rights, or if you want to go out there and fish, you need to have a written lease, and you need to have that written as a clause saying that you are maintaining those rights. If you allow, or if you want to allow a family member, a friend to go out there, you need to retain those rights. If you let somebody go out there and hunt or have any kind of recreation out there, whether it's riding horses in a pasture, Nebraska recreational use law states that if you let somebody use your land recreationally, as long as you do not charge a fee, as long as you do not know that there is certain dangers out there, like a open well that needs to be covered up, or something that's dangerous out there, not just like a tree that fell, but something that like a booby trap. If you do not have that, you are not liable if they fall down and break a leg. Now, if you charge, then you are liable. So if you are going to sublease your hunting rights or rent out your hunting rights to an outfitter per se, that outfitter should have a liability policy. 1 million per incident, a maximum of 2 million is common, that covers the landowner. And if a tenant is subleasing those out, they need to have both the tenant and the landowner listed, covered under that liability policy. So the hunting rights is a lot of times what we see some big drama about. You do not need to have an attorney approve your rental agreements if you don't think it's necessary. If you want to, that is fine. I will go over a couple different resources where you can kind of build these leases. But I really just want to emphasize those hunting rights, because a lot of times recreation is where we find some disagreements on. If you have, I'll cover that in a little bit. All right, so if you're gonna graze corn stalks, what's typically done? So if the tenant is farming it and they want to graze or harvest the bedding, as long as they're not removing all material, we generally say just let them have it. If they're going to be the ones putting up the fence, you're going to have no labor, no inputs in there. Just let them have them. Now, if they're going to be subleasing it, then you should be considering about if you're going to charge extra, or if you're going to get a share of that subleasing agreement. Manure applications, like I said earlier, you want to probably limit how many manure applications are going to happen. I would say once a year, and it just limits that phosphorus. So for the tenant, like I said earlier, we really want to emphasize communication. So force yourself to communicate with the landlord. If you see the landlord is calling, you don't have to have the gut reaction of, oh my goodness, what's going on? They might just be calling to talk about how's the crops looking this year. regardless of if it is a cash lease or a crop lease, you know, they have that emotional attachment to the land, or they have an attachment, whether it's for emotional or not. They want to know how things are doing. So send them a picture, send them, you know, hey, it rained, crops are looking good, or we got a big hailstorm or windstorm, crops are not great here. You know, let them know if you're seeing any extra weed disease. It doesn't take a whole lot to send a picture. So just consider sending a text, an email. The best thing you can do if you are a tenant and the landlord is around the field that you farm is invite them out, have them come out and look at the crops with you. If they have grandkids, all kids love rides in tractors or combines, and it goes a long ways, just to build that relationship. So for the landlord, what do we expect communication for? So we expect you to communicate overall, what do you see happening with that farm? What visions, what goals do you have happening there? If you have expectations with weed control or erosion control, you know, let them know, reflect that in the rent accordingly. What about the non-crop acre management expectations? So if you are renting out a ground that has an abandoned homestead and there is a dry lot attached to it, you don't have any cattle in that dry lot, but are you expected to spray those thistles in that dry lot, or the weeds in there? Or are they going to? What are the expectations for those non-crop acre management? If you have some grassland waterways or, yeah, just the trees, are you going to be responsible for trimming those trees so that your equipment can get in? Just have those expectations communicated to your tenant. And if you're using that farmstead, or they're farming around that farmstead, are they going to be allowed to use that Quonset that's out there? You know, if they are, let them know. And if you have expectations with, just like I said, anything, whether it's mowing the grass around the abandoned house or spraying in the dry lot, just let them know. So communication needs to happen more than once a year. It's more than just, hey, what's my rental rate going to be this year? So it's on both the landlord and the tenant. It's both of them are responsible for communicating with them. Like I said earlier, invite them out to the field, have that conversation more than once a year. It's going to ease the pressure at negotiation time, or at when you're setting the rental rates or shares. It's going to make things a lot easier between both parties. So you also need to think about how the tenant is helping you. So when you're setting that cash rental rate, are they maintaining the terraces and waterways? Are they controlling those noxious weeds? Are they maintaining fences? Are they maintaining that irrigation system, whether it's the well or the pivot? So as I have said, as Jim has said, that if the tenant is helping you with those landlord expenses, the rent should be adjusted. And this is much easier done on a cash rent situation versus a crop share situation. But it needs to be considered, and it needs to be probably written down in a written lease. So we're going to talk about how important a written lease is going to be. So as I have mentioned, we are really urging people to have these leases in writing. So in Nebraska, verbal leases for farmland needs to be terminated by September 1, 6 months prior to the start date of March 1. So if you have a tenant and you are not happy with them and you want to get rid of them, it's Christmas time, unfortunately, you can't, because they have to be terminated by September 1. This is not the same for pasture. In pasture, as I mentioned earlier, pasture rental timeline is for 5 months. And so in a verbal lease, on the last day those cattle are in the pasture, that is when the pasture agreement ends. So you don't have to terminate in pasture. But like I said earlier, communication goes a long way. So if you know that you're going to have somebody else renting that pasture, let them know so that they're not thinking January, I have this pasture we're going to take cattle to. Let them know. It's really a good practice just to let them know so that they can plan accordingly, and then you also can plan accordingly. So timing of in your lease, you need to have the start date of the lease and the end date of the lease. You need to know how things are going to be terminated. If you have a lease that has a holdover clause, so you're going to negotiate this lease, you're going to sign it, and let's say you have some clauses in there that when you're going to reevaluate cash rental rates, all of that. If you do not, and then every single year, it's just going to carry over, and that you guys don't have to re-sign stuff. If you do not have a termination clause in there on how you're going to terminate, how much notice, when it needs to be done by, that holdover clause reverts back to a verbal lease. So if you have that holdover clause and you think that you can terminate whenever because of that holdover clause, it just has to be in writing. That's not the case. If they were to push it, it would revert back to that verbal lease. And so it would need to be done by September 1. And have in your lease written down of when leases will be negotiated. So are you going to look at that every single year after Jim gets his preliminary data in? Are you going to look at it January 1? Whatever you guys can agree upon is an okay date. Just both parties need to agree. And I cannot emphasize this enough. If you have that holdover clause, make sure you have that termination date. So you're going to have a written lease. Where do I go about this? Do I need a lawyer to do it? No, you do not need a lawyer to do it. Dave Aiken is our attorney with K-State Extension. Nebraska Extension. Sorry, I was in K-State for 10 years. And he always says it's always great until it's not. And that's when you need a lawyer. But you don't have to have one. You can go to aglease101.org. You click on the document library and it brings you to this page. Over here, we have different lease publications. If you have a Quonset that you are going to be renting out and it's not on UNL's rates, you can find it here. We don't have a budget to ask every single survey question in a survey. After a survey gets so long, they usually hit the trash can. And so we try to avoid that. But if you have, if you're going to rent out a building, you can see here rental agreements for farm buildings, and this will have a rental rate that you should be charging, whether it's a old building with a dirt floor or a concrete floor. It breaks it out into these different divisions. And you can see here we have a couple different blank lease forms. So here you can download them onto a computer, they're PDF. You can type in your information, save them, so that every single year, if you were to update, it's a quick change out what needs to be changed, but the base is already done. If there are terms or things in here that are not applicable to your farm, you can cross them out. This is very easy to adjust to fit your needs, and it's a good resource too. And it gets you thinking about some things that maybe you haven't thought about. One of them would be subleasing. Are you going to allow any subleasing on your farm? So if you have a section of ground and it has both cropland and pasture, and the person who you're renting the crop ground to, they don't have any cattle, but yet it's all tied together in one lease, then that person could sublease it out if it's not in writing. So if you don't want any subleasing to happen, it needs to be in a clause in writing. So if you are a landowner and you don't have anybody to pass your farm down to, whether your heirs are not involved in the farm or ranch, or you are somebody who wants to get involved in farming and you don't have anybody that you can take over for, Nebraska is working on a solution for that. So we started Nebraska Land Link on February 1st in 2021. We're hoping to match landowners with land seekers and pair them up for the people who want to farm, but then with people who do not have anybody to pass their farm on to. So it's an application, it's online. The website is capunl.edu/land link. We review the applications and we try to match them up and pair them up More information is available on the website there. I just want to make some more comments on farm and ranch succession. So most people do not plan on retiring from farming. So just under 20% never plan. Okay, I'm going to answer this question first. Okay, what if a tenant doesn't tell you until March 15th that he isn't going to farm for you this year? You have the lease that says September 1 of last year. What are your options? Well, there are a lot of other farmers. There's a lot more farmers wanting to farm a piece of ground than ground is available. So you could push the issue saying that, yes, he is going to farm for you, but it's probably not going to be a good situation for either parties. If he does not want to farm, your land is probably not going to be taken the best care of. We always like to have tenants that are going to treat the land as good as you're going to treat it, or hopefully as well, or maybe better. So if he told you March 15th that he isn't going to farm your farm this year, I would personally just put the word out that you are looking for a new tenant, and you'll probably have multiple tenants coming in and talking to you about leasing your ground. If you are absentee and do not live around the area and you're needing some farm recommendations, I personally would probably call the extension office or maybe your bank there, and they have some good recommendations, most likely, of who farms in that area and who might be a good match. Talk to them, feel them out, and see who are you going to have the best relationship with, who's easy to talk to. You can interview different tenants essentially, but that's what I would do. I would essentially screen out some tenants and see what's going to be the best for my land. And another question is, let's see. Okay, this other question is, he switched to a new but experienced CPA for my taxes. He told me that I should have a separate bank account for my farm rent as a landlord, and says I should show more expenses against the land. Does he have a valid point? Personally, I have my personal and farm account separated out just because it's a lot easier to break it into taxes, or what's farm and what's not. And it's easier when it comes to tax time. You don't have to, but it may be a valid point that way you could show more expenses, or maybe just easier for at tax time. If you have a trust, or you guys have a shared agreement, like it's partial owned by yourself, maybe another sibling, I would definitely say that maybe you do, just to keep it separate. Jim, do you have any comments on this one? Maybe he stepped away. But I would say that it's not a bad idea. That way you can at least track to, how much money are you making at the end of the year versus not. A lot of times we don't think our cost of living expenses are that high. So we think that our farm income is not as high, but it's really just our cost of living that is really dragging it down. All right, so retirement plans for Iowa farmers. So yeah, there's about 20% never plan on retiring. They plan dying on the farm. About 53%, let's say, plan on semi-retiring. So what this might look like is they're going to retire, but they are still going to be involved in the management decisions, or maybe they're going to hire someone out to do all the more labor activities, like the lifting, the heavy stuff, but they're going to be very involved in the farm until the day that they die. Only if 20% actually plan on retiring completely. What I wish this slide would have, and maybe it's a good topic in the future to do a survey on, is how many people plan on retiring from their off-farm job, and they plan on retiring to the farm. I think that's included in the semi-retire option. But a lot of people, you know, it's a lifestyle. It's not just a job. They plan on doing it as long as they can. So are you procrastinating on your farm or ranch succession? About 50% of the operations do not have any succession plans, or they are out of date. Like I said earlier, farmers never really plan on retiring. We don't like to think about the death, and we don't like to think about what are we going to do from being so busy to retiring to having nothing to do. So producers have a hard time giving up control of their land. They have controlled it for so long, or they just inherited the piece of ground from their parents. They just got control of it. They may be retirement age, but they are not going to give up that control of the land because they just got full control over it as well. They don't really have any plans for retirement. They don't want to fully retire. That doesn't, we'll cover, I'll get that question in a little bit. Yeah, so we're just never going to retire or do a phased retirement. Newer equipment makes farming a lot easier to farm. It's a lot less labor intensive. It's a lot less lifting, and it's easier to farm now, longer. So let's see, I kind of covered this one, but I think it's important to note that nobody avoids the pine box. Everybody's going to die. And you need to think about what's going to happen with your possessions when you're gone. Not only in your possessions, but farming is a business. So what's going to happen to your business when you're gone? No estate plan is probably going to lead to a lot of discourse in your family, because if there's no plan, people get greedy and family disputes happen. So more often than not, planning tends to be deferred until something happens, like a death in the family, which forces that family to address the matter. And why don't we plan? Well, it's complicated. We assume that everybody's going to get along in the future. We don't like that work. It's a lot of mental work to think about your own death. It's a lot of work about thinking, how are we going to maintain those family relationships when we are in the pine box? And we're afraid that what we do now may be wrong in 10 years. So how we're going to address that is, if you are near the end of any career, there are 3 types of planning that you need to have. So the first one in the orange box is end of life plan documents. And we have to start because even if you're in young or old, you may want to have this option. So if you are a parent and you just had a kid go to college, you might want to have this for them. You might want to have a power of attorney for health and personal, because if something happens and they go into the hospital and they become incapacitated, you can't make any decisions for them, even though they might be on your health insurance. You might still be covering all of their expenses. You have no rights over them unless you have a power of attorney to make any decisions. So as a parent, this is something you might consider if you have someone turning 18, going off to college, something to think about. But especially if you're retiring, nearing end of life stuff, you want to have those documents in place. Who's going to make those big decisions? Have that separate from your business succession planning. What's going to happen with your business? And then what's going to happen with all your stuff? Is it going to go into a will? Are you going to have it into a trust? Are you going to have a life estate deed? Are you trying to avoid probate? Some other, there's a lot of things to consider about what's going to happen. Do you want the flexibility that in your estate plan, you might want to change it in 10 years? Maybe you get another grandchild, or maybe there is a divorce in the family. Maybe somebody make some poor life decisions and you don't want the family farm going to them because you don't think it'll stay in the family. When you're thinking about your estate plan, think about those options, because no matter are you going to set it up in an irrevocable trust or a life estate plan? Each one of those kind of will give you a different level of flexibility to change things in the future. So how you should go about planning this is, Okay, one, you should have a plan. And you think that, and then you go into, I'm gonna go to a meeting. I'm gonna go to a meeting, and then third step is, okay, this is complicated. I have a headache. Then you go to the fourth step, and so you don't have any action done. So the circle of inaction keeps on going around and round and round. So you start again at step one of saying, I should have a plan. Then you go to step two again. And this really just goes. So how we get people thinking, or how to get out of this circle of inaction is step one, write down what you have. If you want to get a little cheat on this, is if you have a loan out, your bank probably has a rough inventory of what you have. So maybe you go and ask your bank for a balance sheet or what they have down for inventory if you don't want to sit down and write it all down. And that's a good start. Write down what you have. Then step two, have your family meet, get the input, who's in, who's out, who wants just hard cash, who wants the land. Who wants grandma's pie plate? Get that stuff all down. And the step three, have a plan, have what your goals are. Do you want the family to own the land? Do you want family to farm the land? Or do you just want to have your kids decide what they need to have happen in their life? Just have that happen. Do you want your family have the first right to buy it? Do you want your tenant to have it? And then we talk about sweat equity. You know, if you're going to consider sweat equity, what's your sweat equity plan? I like the percentage for every year that you're contributing to the farm, just because it's probably the easiest and straightforward way of thinking about how sweat equity plays into transition planning. Now, what percentage needs to be worked out among the parents and the kids? You know, that's all up to debate, but I think it's a lot easier than going in and saying this was the value of the farm before I started, afterwards. But it's all just depending on what you guys want to come together as a family. So after you have your plan, after you have the bullet points of your goals and your inventory, take it to a professional. As if you have those professionals, everything down, what your goals are, those professionals are going to be able to work more efficiently for you. Yeah, a lawyer could sit down in the office and he could listen to your family bicker back and forth, and that's just going to be extra charges for you. But if you have everything done, it's going to be a lot more efficient, a lot more cost effective for that professional to put it in place. Once you get it all signed, just review it periodically. Has situations changed, like I said, and then make sure that you make those changes to your estate plan, transition plan. So I just want to emphasize that having no plan leads to a lot of chaos. I think we all know of families or have been involved in families that this has been the case. You think that there's a plan, and maybe they told you there was a plan, but turns out that that's not really a great plan. And so there's just a lot of chaos in families. It causes greed. It tears apart families. And there is a video here. Hopefully I can get to play.
Rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it.
All right, so this video is going to be a test of fairness involving emotion, and what they're going to do is hand monkeys some different treats, and we can see how they react.
To give a rock to us. That's a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. He gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. He tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay, so sorry, I don't want to restart that. All right, so what the video is going over is you gave a rock to a monkey and they get a treat back. one monkey is getting a grape, another monkey is getting a cucumber. And the one that's getting the cucumber, even though she's getting something at the same time, it's not the grape. And so therefore, it's gonna lead to chaos and it's upset because it wants the grape. What another family maybe has inherited that another sibling wanted. It's gonna just cause chaos in the family because there's no plan.
Okay. Give me a second here, Anastasia. Hey, when we're switching over, can I ask a question for you and you can respond?
Yep.
A question that came in when you were going through your information, it stated, what kind of liability insurance do I need for a cash rent situation? So I'm assuming this person is renting out the property to someone. What type of liability insurance should this person have?
Right. So you will probably need a liability insurance policy for the ground itself. So go talk to a insurance agent, maybe it's a $1 million policy, whatever fits your needs, but you probably need to have a liability insurance on the land itself. And then the tenant will have a farm liability and policy as well. If you are renting a pasture, the landowner should have liability insurance on that pasture, and the tenant should have liability insurance on the cows itself. And I guess since we're talking about liability here, and Jim and I just had some presentations over the week on this as well. But if you have cattle and your cows are out on the road, it doesn't make you automatically liable for those cattle. If somebody hit it, it doesn't make you automatically liable. They have to prove like your
Negligence.
fences, negligence. You have to show that either the fences were left open, fences are not maintained, they're repeatedly going out and on the road when somebody hit it. So unless they can prove negligence, you're not automatically liable for that cattle being out on the road itself. Now, I will say here that if you are a tenant watching this, or you have the cattle and you are getting repeated phone calls from the sheriff that, hey, you have some cows out on the road, if they are not yours, you need to call the sheriff and say, they are not mine. You can either say that they are your neighbors, or you can just say that they're not mine, but just to have it documented that they're not yours, because let's say your cattle do get out on the road, and anybody who has cattle know that at some point your cattle are going to get out on the road. If the sheriff's office has repeated times that they have called you to say, that could be the negligence that is needed to make you liable for that accident.
All right. And the total dollar amount of the liability insurance typically is equal to the value of the land. Or I have $800,000 worth of land. Well, you'd probably want to get a $1 million liability policy, plus whatever personal money, home, just in general liability insurance for people, even if you don't necessarily own land or farm. You usually want to have liability insurance roughly equal to what do you have for assets. I own a car, I own a home, I have some cash, and I have a big retirement account. That's usually what it is. So, all right, very good. Let's just have a couple more slides here, and then we're going to wrap everything up. If you got any questions, type them in either for Anastasia or myself, and we'll take an attempt to answer them. If you like the webinar we're doing today, Anastasia and I do what is called Ag Land Management Quarterly. It's a 1-hour webinar. We don't send anything out for it, but it's a 1-hour webinar. We kind of let the topics vary subject to the time of the year and what people are interested in. We have our agenda up here, which will have some repeat because we usually don't do our traditional landlord tenant cash rent meetings online. But if you'd like to join, you can also submit a question. And if we have enough time to prepare, we'll actually make a slide or two up before the meeting starts. If you like the type of information you're seeing today, the University of Nebraska Foundation has a small endowment that helps with our administrating the farm real estate survey. It's the Nebraska Ag Land Studies Fund. We've had people in the past make a small donation. All the information will always stay free. It's just when you send out surveys, the cost of printing and postage adds up. So if anyone finds their information useful today, the little website link and the phone number are right there. And you can get in touch with somebody from the NU Foundation if you got questions. Also, special thanks to ZAG Land Zag Land out of Humphrey, Nebraska with Sam Zock. You can see the list of services that Sam provides: consultations, farm management, lease analysis. I find him to be a very approachable, and I greatly appreciate ZAG Land sponsorship. And as always, if you're an agribusiness professional and you want to sponsor something like this in the future, shoot us an email and we'll see what we can do with you. But with that, I'll leave our contact information up here. I am not seeing any questions that have gotten submitted here in the last minute or two, but we'll just stay on here for a minute. And if anybody has any other questions, please just type them in here quick. Anastasia, do you have any other comments? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I don't have any extra comments, but I will say, don't hesitate on reaching out to us. There's a couple other ag economists around the state, and we're just here to help you through these situations.
Oh, one thing I forgot in your handout, there's actually an end of meeting evaluation with a return envelope. Please make that out. That's your cost of attendance. That information helps us make the program better, and it helps us with our grant reporting. So please return that if you have the time. Any comments, good, bad, anything in between? We're always looking for feedback. Okay. Not seeing any other questions, and it's like people are starting to slip off the call here, which is fine. Brian, do you have any other thing to add?
No, just thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll get this recording up on the website where you can find the handouts.
Yep, we'll be getting those out in the next week or so. So appreciate everyone for joining us.